The Cold War is not limited to espionage, giant submarines, and space racing. First of all, it is connected with the presence of bunkers, stocks of canned food, and the constant expectation of a nuclear winter. It is surprising, however, that governments were initially concerned about the well-being of their citizens, and they had plans not only for a nuclear exchange, but also for the subsequent development of events. Perhaps the US had a secret plan to rebuild the state after a nuclear war, the cost of which was billions of dollars. In the next couple of minutes, we'll talk about it and talk about the most mysterious bunker on the planet, which is still functioning and has an annual budget of $45 million. The story of this event begins in the best traditions of spy thrillers, with unclear moral lines, where it is difficult to determine who is right and who is wrong. In the movie, Ryan Gosling plays the main role, and you are always on his side. However, in real life, the protagonists of the beginning of the Cold War were Winston Churchill, who had just defeated Germany and pondered which parts of Europe would be occupied after the war, and the second hero, who devised Operation Unthinkable to attack USSR preventively. It is interesting to note that this happened on May 22, 1945, 4 months before the end of World War II. The start date for the plan was set for July 1, 1945, to draw Britain into the war against the USSR, even before the end of the war against Japan. This was the main feature of the unthinkable operation to attack at a time when the USSR already believed that the war was over. However, the coordination of the plan was delayed, and when the United States conducted nuclear tests on August 6, 1945, Churchill suggested that it be finalized. According to information disclosed by the FBI, the leader of Britain proposed the bombing of the Kremlin as early as 1945, with the hope of creating political devastation in the USSR, which could lead to a civil war. In fact, the truth about the plans for Operation Unthinkable was passed on to the USSR by the Cambridge Five, a group of Soviet intelligence agents led by Arnold Deutsch. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh found a drop-down order addressed to Marshal Georgy Zhukov in June 1945 about a sudden regrouping of troops and preparations for a possible defense, as well as advice on strengthening Moscow's air defenses. It is important to note that all these actions took place even before the official end of World War II. Such spy games were followed and continued, and it was only by miracle that the Third World War did not start instantly. Even after 1945, the situation did not change much, and researchers Misu Kaku and Daniel D., in their book, Relying on the Pentagon's Revealing Plans, mentioned that there were at least 9 plans to bombard the USSR with nuclear weapons. The problem was solely the number of nuclear warheads by 1948. Their number has always been small, only 50. However, in 1949, the number of warheads rose to 250, and the Pentagon declared that defeating the USSR with minimal losses became an achievable goal. How the story could develop further remains unknown. However, on August 29, 1949, the USSR successfully tested its atomic bomb and accompanied it with traditional hints that they had tens of thousands of such bombs, half of which were satellite-guided, and the other half could be delivered to the United States by Space Marines. Of course, it was all a bluff, but on that day the world realized that there would be no game on gate days. And so began the era of bunkers, the only places where you could escape from a nuclear war. Bunkers became a lucrative business, sold alongside new homes, advertised for portable models, and bragged about canned food supplies at parties. However, the US government faced an existential question. What is the US really like, a working vertical of power with a good president? Or does the answer to this question depend on the inhabitants? The answer to this question was crucial to the country's main plan, the plan for recovery from a nuclear disaster. Predictably, the first thing the government decided to do was to ensure its own security. And almost immediately after the USSR's atomic bomb test in early 1950, $35 million was allocated to purchase 280 acres of land in Pennsylvania. In 2023 dollars, that amount is about 400 million, which is roughly the cost of an airport in Dubai. With this money, a complex was built, which to this day is a tempting piece for conspiracy theories, the legendary Raven Rock, reminiscent of the Fallout 3 game. This complex aroused suspicions for a reason, because it really is a huge underground city. Inside the mountain are 3-story buildings, including police stations, fire stations, a 24 work-in team, residential areas, and office buildings. In fact, this is the second Pentagon, only more secure. Naturally, Raven Rock's modern look wasn't achieved right away. In 1991, it was generally abandoned as an unnecessary object, but in 2001, after well-known events, it was again updated, expanded, and modernized. Officially for 2018, the bunker had an annual budget of $45 million and could accommodate 5,000 officials, keeping them alive for 8 months. According to reliable sources from old documents, it can be seen that already in 1963, Raven Rock was designed to withstand the explosion of a 140-kiloton bomb in close proximity. Over time, it is likely that the level of resilience has been improved, and more efficient processes have been developed for the evacuation of the main persons of the state in case of danger. The residence of the President of the United States, known as Camp David, is located in the countryside and is the most popular. By a strange coincidence, unfortunately, it is only 10 kilometers from the Raven Rock bunker. There are even theories about a possible tunnel connecting them, but at the moment there is no evidence to support these assumptions. However, for ordinary citizens who survived by personal and public bunkers, the government has provided that the U.S. Postal Service and the National Park Service can take care of it. While it sounds like the start of a joke, it's actually a logical approach. Presumably, national parks will not be the target of the bombing, so they can organize camps for survivors. As for Mail, who, if not she, knows the real addresses of people best of all. After the bombings, the survivors were in the camps, where the first thing they did was fill out Form 801. Millions of copies of these forms were kept in post offices throughout the Cold War. Then the data was analyzed and people were informed about which camps their relatives were in, and communications were gradually established between them to provide them with food. The USDA has developed special crackers made from bulgur, known since the days of Babylon, that is cooked with boiling water. This knowledge of the ancients became the key to solving the problem of the duration of food storage. In a speech to Congress in 1962, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Civil Defense, Paul Wisher, noted that bulgur remained edible after 3,000 years in the Egyptian pyramid, and this determines its shelf life. By 1964, 20 billion crackers were produced, which is 160 million tons, which were distributed to bunkers throughout the country. Parallel to this, the idea of a grandmother's pantry was promoted, which motivated citizens to stockpile food for the Day of Judgment. More than 1,000 different combinations of products were developed, which people actively collected and stockpiled. However, the main plot twist after the apocalypse was that one of the key players in the New World was the tax administration. Nuclear war was not enough reason to avoid paying taxes, and the U.S. government calculated that it would take people only 18 months to start paying taxes again after a nuclear winter. In this regard, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, together with the Federal Reserve System, built their own bunker called Mount Pony. There were $2 billion in cash, mostly in the form of $2 bills. These denominations were chosen due to their unpopularity at the time, in order to avoid their unnecessary use. The financiers logically assumed that after a nuclear war, people's demands would be more modest, and no one would demand $2 bills. Moreover, government organizations with less authority, which were not needed after a nuclear war, faced severe restrictions on the quality and quantity of salvaged items. This resulted in the National Archives being forced to include the Declaration of Independence on the evacuation list, giving it precedence over the Constitution. The Library of Congress, after much deliberation, decided to retain the text of Lincoln's 1863 Gettysburg Address, but abandoned the memoirs of George Washington. The situation became even more complicated in 1967, when the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted, establishing the order of succession of power upon the death of the president. The vice president became president, then Speaker of Congress, and so on. This resulted in the need to evacuate a huge number of officials, and decentralization was the preferred option. In addition to the Rabun Rock Bunker, Mount Weather bunkers in Virginia, Colorado, and many others were also built. In addition, the retaliation launch process has been modified. Contrary to popular belief, the president's nuclear briefcase contained no buttons, but included fingerprint keys and other identification mechanisms. During the Cold War, the president chose from a set of cards the most suitable nuclear war scenario, like ordering at a restaurant. He had only 8 to 12 minutes to make a decision, and the loaves flew in the opposite direction. Thus, the plan for the restoration of the activities of the state after a nuclear war provided for the evacuation of the government to bunkers, and the population had to cope on its own. Initially, the plan looked good, but with the development of thermonuclear weapons, the situation became much more dangerous. But no one made fundamental changes to the plan, simply because the bunkers for the government are ready, but people somehow figure it out themselves. Until we meet again, friends.